Pacing and structure are both things that are vital when it comes to the craft behind the gameplay or story of any title. In fact, scrap that, they're both important to everything. Whether it's the way songs have a typical verse and chorus structure or the story beats of a book or film, there are basic guidelines and rules for the way things are paced and the order in which certain events are put. A pace that's too erratic or a structure that's too loose can lead to a pretty inconsistent or confused experience. Pacing has to be perfect so that the player doesn't lose interest or get tired. Even the most compelling combat system can get boring if there's no space to rest, and the most intriguing narrative can eventually become a confusing mess if it spends so much time dabbling in high concepts that it forgets how to effectively use basic setup and payoff. The opening of a game is something that needs very careful pacing. It's the first impression, after all, the hook that gets the player invested. Valve loves to do this by easing the player into the world through slow, almost relaxing gameplay-like sequences. Take the opening of Half-Life, for example. For most of the thing you're just riding a tram or listening to scientists complain about the coffee machine or whatever. But what makes this compelling is that it draws you into the mundane, slow life of a physicist, so that when shit finally does hit the fan, it packs a lot more impact. It's the contrast between a slow-paced build-up and the sudden payoff of a science facility completely overrun by aliens that makes the sequence so memorable. Half-Life 2 did the same kind of thing, and while it did work in its own right, it feels slightly less surprising simply because the change in pace isn't quite as drastic. Even though the intro does still involve a lot of just walking around and talking to people, there's still evidently something wrong right from the start, and the big moment isn't as jarring. You just have a couple civil protection guys chasing after you. I'm not saying I want all intros to be as drawn out as Half-Life's though. A lot of games tend to jump right into things, both as a quick introduction to the game's mechanics and as a way of grabbing the player's attention by throwing them right into the story. This was more common back before story was given so much focus in games, but it can still occasionally be seen today. For example, back in 2009 in Uncharted 2, the game utilized a narrative technique called in medias res, which basically means starting the story from the midpoint. What makes this work, however, isn't just the allusion to the story shenanigans that could have led to that moment, nor the thrill of seeing someone fall through a dangling train, but the fact that it also acts as an introduction for the player to the gameplay of the series. The game only indulges on a cutscene for a brief moment so as to set the scene, and from there on it's down to the player to make their way up the train. In the process, you're introduced to climbing, one of the main focuses of the title, while also not being in any real danger as there aren't any enemies to shoot you and pretty much all the perilous moments occur in scripted sequences. It's easy to get immediately interested, both because you're quickly taught one of the main mechanics of the game, and because the story starts off from one of the most tense scenarios. In the case of 2012's Dragon's Dogma, it feels as if the development team didn't really have any idea of how they wanted to pace the opening at all. It opens at a very climactic moment, immediately getting the player to know the combat and setting the pace for a really fast-moving, epic adventure. The problem is that just a short while after this, the game's pace slows down enormously. There's never any pressing story-related issue, and nothing that's done in the game builds towards the ultimate goal. The only time the plot does kick up is near the end, making the game feel like it's just getting started right before it's finished. It feels like driving a race car, slamming it into a wall, then starting up another car 20 hours later only to find you've reached the end of the track anyway. A series like The Legend of Zelda is a good example of following a particular pattern, not only due to how it's often noted for its repetitive structure, but also because it really is quite a very typical old-fashioned tale. If you've ever read or even really heard of the book Save the Cat, then you'll be familiar with the 3-act structure. There's a great video out there on this structure using examples from movies, so in case you wanted to check that out, I'll put a link in the description. Zelda games tend to follow this structure almost all the time because it simply works, even if they overdo certain aspects like Twilight Princess's drawn-out setup. The structure works well to establish a setting, a goal, have a turning point a few dungeons in, establish a secondary goal, have the climax, and then obligatory goodbye scene at the end of every Zelda nowadays. It's worth noting that at a very basic level, dungeons also follow this structure. There's the setup in which the initial mechanic of the dungeon is introduced, halfway through there's a turning point in which a new item is found to shake up the dungeon gimmick, and finally there's a climax in the form of a boss fight, rewarding you with a heart container. Clearly lots of other games have used bosses at regular intervals to set the pace. The most obvious example is probably Mega Man. The entire series is centered around a repeated structure of entering a stage, learning and overcoming the unique obstacles presented in said stage, then fighting a boss and being rewarded with a power-up. Having the same kind of structure for each stage allows the player to have this choice of which stage to pick in which order, because they're all isolated incidents with different gimmicks. The player can also approach stages in any order they wish, because the isolated structure means that levels don't have to build up on the mechanics that the previous one has introduced. Level design in platformers usually boils down to one of two scenarios. You either have each individual level introduce, teach, then have the player master some new challenge, or have a specific gimmick or mechanic build up over many levels throughout the course of a world. I already talked about how Tropical Freeze did the former superbly in another video, but Super Meat Boy was the game that did the latter very well. Each level is very short and typically only requires the player to conquer one or two challenges to move on to the next one. The fast respawn and lack of a live system keep the pace snappy, and considering the levels are so short, when you die you don't lose a load of progress. Often each level will introduce some new quick challenge to overcome, and then in a later level down the line, all of these smaller challenges may culminate into one obstacle. It also means that if you've already learned how to get past previous obstacles, you don't have to trudge through a lengthy level all over again just to get to the one part you're stuck on. You can just jump right in and get on with it. This also makes the whole process of collecting bandages a lot quicker, seeing as you can just get in, get the bandage, and get out without any unnecessary hassle. Being able to constantly provide new challenges for the player is quite a difficult task. It's why a lot of games nowadays tend to have sections which completely subvert, or in some cases abandon the core gameplay mechanics simply for the sake of shaking things up. Obligatory stealth segments in action games seem to be a big offender of this. It's an easy way to keep things fresh, however this usually has the unfortunate side effect of meaning neither one nor the other mechanic gets fully fleshed out. It's also why you get a lot of exposition scenes in action games nowadays. However fun the combat is, having a completely straight gauntlet of enemies would just be really tiring. You need something to break it up. Even in something like Bloody Palace mode in Devil May Cry, it's not just one long stage, there's time to rest after each fight. In the main game too, lots of platforming sequences, or puzzles if you can really call them that, partly to fill up the game time but also so there's a sort of relief when the next fight comes around. That's what a lot of this structure and pacing thing comes down to really, build up and payoff. Structure is pretty much the backbone to any work, it ties things together into something that's actually cohesive. But while having, say, bosses recurring at regular intervals may work as an incentive for people to play more of the game, it can in some unfortunate circumstances lend to a repetitive, almost predictable nature across a title or series. Nintendo seems to have realised this for the next Zelda game, ditching the typical structure for a more open experience, and whether that will turn out good or bad, only time will tell. While there's been a lot of rave over the whole open world thing in a lot of games lately, it's worth remembering that something more linear means the developers can ensure a tighter structure or more controlled difficulty, pace and progression. So yes, basic structure and pacing are important, otherwise I wouldn't have made this video, but at times subverting expectations can be just as valuable and create some memorable moments. Just make sure the whole game doesn't end up as a jumbled, directionless mess.